Say what now? Yeah, you read that right. And no, this isn't some wild tale cultivated and unjustly exposed by Quincy Jones. Stemming from the source's very own source, Foxy, My Life in Three Acts, Pam Grier gave us all the inside deets about her days linked to comedy's finest, Richard Pryor. In a case of were the 70s a real decade, or were we all just dreaming, Pam first hinted at developing stage 4 cancer back in the 80s. Upon hearing the devastating news, the revelation following the discovery would make almost anyone question everything. Well, anyone who wasn't alive during the groovy baby era of the 70s, that is. According to Pam's doctor, cocaine was discovered on her cervix that could have been the culprit to the growing cancer cells. How it got there is an even more complex story that, luckily for you, we're about to get into. A Beverly Hills epidemic, if you will. That's what the doctor who discovered Pam Grier's life-threatening illness had called it. Cocaine being found on one's cervix? Now how'd that get up in there? But first, Pam Grier and Richard Pryor? How'd that happen? On the set of one of Pryor's first leading roles, Greased Lightning. After rising to prominence in the early 70s, the gun-toting fly honey and action's first leading lady, according to Quentin Tarantino, Pam Grier solidified herself as the queen of blast and jive turkeys, as well as the queen of blaxploitation cinema. Steadily climbing the blaxploitation ladder, her rise in popularity continued to blossom, and with the fame came the men's, plural. After starring in her most notable role, the pop culture icon, Foxy Brown. Needless to say, Pam was sought after by everyone in Hollywood. Everyone wanted a pick at her afro, wink wink, including comedian Freddie Prinze Sr., who'd end up ironically playing matchmaker between Pam and Richard. Freddie was linked to Pam long before Richard ever was, and during Pam and Freddie's last days as an item, Richard and Freddie would eventually cross paths. Pam's name was soon to be mentioned, and Freddie would wind up introducing Pam to Richard, who thought Pam would be a perfect fit to star alongside him in his starring film, Greased Lightning. Now, how the two went from co-leads to being in an actual relationship is another wild story of its own. But if you couldn't tell by the title, wild is the theme of Pam and Richard's entire union. It was the first day on set. Production crew, costume designers, hair and makeup artists alike maneuvering around doing what they do. Pam's eagerness was through the roof, not only because she was starring in yet another film, but because she'd be working with the one and only Richard Pryor. Everything was set in place except for the man of the hour, or two, himself. Being late was something Richard was known for versus Pam's insistence on always being on time. While Pryor was taking his sweet time, Pam's excitement began dwindling less and less, and when he finally did decide to reveal his face, Pam's was a sweaty hot mess. Her makeup was ruined, and her dress was soaked like she'd spent the day at the beach and not on the set. After a few touch-ups, Pam was finally about to film, but Richard had other ideas. Picking up a fork, he began to improvise. He's gone completely off script, poking the fork in Pam's face whilst taunting her vision in the process. Slapping the utensil out of his hand Foxy Brown style, enough was enough, and Pam was gonna let him have it. How you gonna show up hours late then step foot on this right here set and play games? Focus! It'd been at that very moment that Richard Pryor fell head over heels for Pamela. One of the biggest actresses at that time, dating one of the biggest comedians of his time. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot apparently. I think we can all agree that Miss Foxy or Jackie, whichever you prefer, was that girl. Being seen with Pamela locked around your arm was a huge deal, and vice versa. She was all that, but what really set her apart from the rest was her caring heart. She became like a mother figure to Richard, aiding in the development of his overall being. One of his biggest insecurities had always been his illiteracy. He may have been funny, but our guy was as dumb as a doorknob. No disrespect. Pam taught him how to read, write, and had even been the force behind him quitting one of his deadliest habits, drug addiction. Richard was tired of the high life and took a whack at being sober, which he'd succeed for about 6 to 9 months before relapsing. But Pam suspects he had relapsed way before then. Recalling an incident where Richard had invited some friends over to his home while Pam was around, she walks into the kitchen and finds a bunch of booze and cocaine set on top of a mirror surrounded by rolled up $100 bills. Knowing Richard was on his road to recovery, his buddies were sensitive to his situation, opting to get high before they'd step foot on Richard's property. But one day, all that supporting your friend on his new journey stuff was gone like the wind, where the drugs probably should have followed suit. Confronting her man, Pam hit Richard with some tough loving and told him about his so-called friends who'd never supply the party favors, instead choosing to mooch off of Rich. He denied snorting the line of white snow, and about his boys? Well, Richard wasn't trying to hear none of that. But deep down, he knew Pamela was right. Eventually, the drugs were just too powerful for Richard to completely get rid of, and he'd unfortunately end up right back at square one. Pam and Richard's relationship hit an all-time low after a discovery made by Pam's doctor changed her life forever. After noticing something wasn't quite right within her body, Pam set up an appointment with her doctor. What she discovered was something no one ever thought was possible, let alone ever wanted to hear. Upon taking a few tests, her doctor hesitantly began to ask questions, going on to inform her about a dangerous epidemic in Beverly Hills. No, not plastic surgery, but a buildup of cocaine residue around a woman's cervix and inside their hoo-has. Taken aback, Pam, similar to many of you watching, was left in confusion. "Well, are you doing drugs?" her doctor asked, to which Pam uttered a strong "no." "Well, is your partner putting cocaine on his peener wiener to sustain his erection? Are you sure he isn't doing it in the bathroom before he comes to bed?" Pam hesitated before answering, "That's a possibility. You know, I am dating Richard Pryor." Immediately, an alarm rang off. If Richard wasn't putting the devil's grits directly on his genitals, then that must mean the coke was deep inside of his seminal fluids. Further probing Grier for answers, her doctor then asked if her mouth ever went numb after going down on Richard. Well, yes. Pam's answer was yes, and that was all the doc needed to know to link the cocaine found on Pam's cervix to Richard's coke habits. Practically leaping from her seat following the visit, Pam confided in Richard that same night and confronted him about applying cocaine to his area, to which he'd quickly deny. Well, that's great and all if it were true, but all this raw dogging had to stop immediately. When Pam told him just that, he was not here for it. Not only that, but when she'd ask him to at least speak to her doctor, he refused. Pam was not only his girlfriend, but within the short time span they've dated, became his teacher, his financial advisor, and his healer. She ignited the fire within him to go sober for the majority of their time together, and yet, when it came to a life or death situation such as cervical cancer, Richard wasn't willing to have one conversation with Pam's doctor. It was at that moment Pamela came to the realization that Richard Pryor didn't love her like she thought. She was his healer, but she couldn't be his savior. As time went on, Richard's drug abuse had become all too much for her. She was beyond tired of helping him and finally put her foot all the way down. In their latter days, more tough lovin' was whipped out with the hope of Richard changing for the better. But when he wouldn't, Pam made the ultimate decision to end the relationship. Whether Richard's bad habits were the actual cause of Pam's cervical cancer is up for debate. Some doctors say it's impossible. Applicable or not, Pam's recall sure makes for a great Hollywood story. Can you believe all of that happened within the span of a year? Did you know about Pam and Richard's relationship? Let us know your thoughts and opinions down below in the comments. And stay tuned for more true celebrity stories.